Some criminals commit crimes so horrifying that their names become etched in history as symbols of fear. These are the individuals whose violent actions shook the very core of America, leaving a trail of devastation and unanswered questions. In today's video, we'll delve into the chilling stories of serial killers, spree killers, and ruthless predators, each one contributing to the darkest chapters of American crime. Roger Dale Stafford, the Oklahoma murderer. On a freezing winter night in 1974, Jimmy Earl Berry, a 20-year-old assistant manager at a McDonald's in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, was closing up for the night. Little did he know, Roger Dale Stafford was hiding nearby, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In a flash, 4 gunshots rang out, and Berry was left lying lifeless on the floor, his killer walking away with $390. It took years for investigators to connect Stafford to this brutal crime, but this murder was only the beginning of his killing spree. By 1978, Stafford had recruited his wife, Vera, and his brother, Harold, into his deadly world. Their method was horrifyingly simple. Vera would pretend to be stranded on the side of the road, playing the helpless victim in need of help. On June 22, 1978, Melvin, Linda, and their 12-year-old son, Richard, were on their way to a funeral when they stopped to assist what they thought was a woman in distress on Interstate 35. Sadly, the Lawrence family never made it to the funeral. 3 weeks later, Stafford entered a Sirloin Stockade restaurant in Oklahoma City. What followed that night would leave a permanent scar on the community. 6 young employees, including 17-year-old David Lindsay, 16-year-old David Salmon, and the youngest victim, 15-year-old Terry Horst, were ruthlessly gunned down during a shift that should have been routine. As the investigation unfolded, Vera Stafford turned on her husband, revealing the extent of his horrific actions. She helped authorities piece together the disturbing truth. Roger was responsible for up to 34 murders across 7 states. On July 1, 1995, Stafford was executed by lethal injection. He maintained his innocence until the end, offering no final words before his death. But the tale of Roger Stafford didn't end there. Just 2 days after his execution, a bizarre package arrived at the Oklahoma Attorney General's office. Inside was a Sirloin Stockade gift certificate with a cryptic message that continued to deny his guilt. Signed with Stafford's prison number, the note left investigators baffled, as the mystery surrounding his case remains unsolved to this day. Tommy Lynn Sells, the coast-to-coast killer. Tommy Lynn Sells never knew what it was like to stay in one place long enough to call it home. By the time he was just 14 years old, he was hitchhiking across America, drifting from town to town with a darkness creeping inside him. Abandoned by his family at a young age, Tommy's life had been marked by neglect and abuse. When his mother and siblings disappeared, leaving him behind in their wake, Tommy was left to navigate a harsh world alone. His early years were consumed by substance abuse. Drugs and alcohol provided a fleeting escape from the pain that gnawed at him. But something far darker was stirring within him, something that would soon unleash unspeakable violence. From 1978 to 1999, Tommy crisscrossed the country, his bloody trail stretching across state lines, from Mississippi to Missouri, Illinois, and beyond. Wherever the trains and highways led him, death seemed to follow closely behind. In 1987, the depths of his savagery were revealed during the Dardeen family massacre in Illinois. Keith Dardeen, a kind-hearted man, had offered Tommy a ride. For his generosity, he and his pregnant wife, along with their unborn child, paid the ultimate price. It was a shocking display of brutality that would leave investigators reeling. But it was a miraculous turn of events that would finally bring Tommy to justice. On New Year's Eve, 1999, 10-year-old Crystal Searles managed to survive a brutal attack that should have claimed her life. With her throat slashed, she somehow managed to stagger a quarter of a mile, seeking help. Her description of the attacker led authorities directly to Tommy. On April 3, 2014, as the lethal injection flowed through his veins, Tommy was given one last chance to speak. His response, a cold, emotionless no. The highway killer. Aileen Wuornos's workplace was the stretch of Florida highways that cut through the heart of the state. But by 1989, it had become a killing ground. As a sex worker on the fringes of society, Eileen encountered men who would never return home to their families. Her life had been a tragic series of events: abandoned by her mother, sexually abused by her grandfather, and pregnant at just 15 years old. By the time she was a teenager, she was already living on the streets, fighting just to survive. Her first victim, Richard Malalari, was a 51-year-old electronics store owner with a dark past. He was a convicted sex offender. In November 1989, when Aileen shot him dead, she claimed it was in self-defense. This story would become her defense in subsequent killings. Over the next year, 6 more men lost their lives after picking up Aileen along the highways. She insisted that every single one of them had tried to assault her and that she was merely protecting herself. But the truth, buried beneath layers of manipulation and self-justification, was far more complex. Aileen's downfall came not at the hands of the law, but from the one person she trusted, her lover, Tyria Moore. Under immense pressure, Tyria agreed to work with the police, secretly recording Aileen's confessions. Over 4 days of tense phone calls, Aileen's facade crumbled, and the woman she loved most became the catalyst for her capture. By 2001, Aileen's mental state had deteriorated drastically. She began to speak of imaginary attacks by sonic weapons and insisted that her execution be hastened. "I'm so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff," she said. "I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." On June 6, 2002, as the lethal injection took its toll, Aileen's final words were cryptic and surreal. "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Her last moments, as strange as they were a fitting end to a life that had been marked by tragedy, violence, and a tragic search for control in a world that never offered it. The DC Sniper. For 23 terrifying days in October 2002, Washington, D.C. became a city in constant fear. John Allen Muhammad and his teenage accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, turned the everyday acts of life into chilling life-or-death scenarios. Pumping gas, walking to school, simply buying groceries, any of these moments could be your last. Armed with a modified blue Chevrolet Caprice, Muhammad had made an ingenious yet deadly alteration, a hole in the trunk that allowed them to shoot unsuspecting victims while remaining concealed inside the vehicle. The pair's killing spree was unlike anything the public had seen before. Victims ranged from a 13-year-old boy shot outside his school to innocent commuters filling their gas tanks. The unpredictability of their attacks was the most frightening element. There was no way to know who would be next or where the next shooting would take place. Authorities quickly realized they were facing a much deeper, darker plan: Muhammad's twisted scheme to extort $10 million from the government. But as investigators soon discovered, there were far more sinister and personal motives behind the violence. In fact, their killing spree wasn't confined to D.C. Malvo later confessed to a shocking revelation. Their murderous trail stretched back even further, with at least 14 victims in California, Arizona, and Texas. Their coast-to-coast rampage brought their victim count to a staggering 31. Their reign of terror ended abruptly at a rest stop along Interstate 70 in Maryland. There, police found the pair sleeping in their modified car, bringing an end to the killings. Muhammad was convicted of capital murder, terrorism, conspiracy, and firearm violations after the murder of Dean Harold Myers in Virginia. On March 9, 2004, he was sentenced to death. Under Virginia law, Muhammad had the option to choose between lethal injection or electrocution, but when he refused to make a choice, lethal injection was selected for him by law. Muhammad's final meal consisted of chicken, red sauce, and cake. On November 10, 2009, he was executed by lethal injection, declining to offer any final words. William George Bonin, the Freeway Killer. In 1979, the freeways of Southern California became the hunting grounds for one of the most notorious killers in the state's history, William George Bonin. Young men would vanish without a trace, having accepted rides from what seemed like a friendly stranger, only to end up as the latest headline when their bodies were discovered along the roadside. Bonin's path to violence began early, shaped by a horrific childhood filled with abuse. His time in Vietnam further twisted his psyche, reinforcing a worldview defined by control and brutality. When Bonin returned to California, he brought with him the dark lessons of violence and domination. Teaming up with accomplices like Vernon Butts and Gregory Miley, Bonin devised a chilling modus operandi. Driving around in his van, Bonin would offer rides to hitchhikers and runaways, turning his van into a gruesome mobile torture chamber, equipped with everything necessary for his twisted games. On August 5, 1979, Bonin's first known victim, 17-year-old German exchange student Marcus Grabs, became the victim of Bonin's cruelty. Marcus had come to America with hopes of experiencing the American dream, but instead, his life was violently snatched away. He was found stabbed 77 times, the first of many bodies that would be discovered along Southern California's freeways in the months to come. The killing continued unabated, and on February 3, 1980, Bonin and Miley picked up 15-year-old Charles Miranda in West Hollywood. After murdering him, Bonin casually told Miley, "I need another one." Within minutes, they found 12-year-old James McCabe on his way to Disneyland, and the cycle of violence continued. Bonin's killing spree finally came to an end on June 11, 1980, when police caught him in the act of assaulting 15-year-old Harold in his van. Inside, they discovered a scrapbook, a chilling collection of newspaper clippings about his own crimes, which he had been keeping as trophies. In 1996, Bonin was prepared to face the ultimate consequence for his atrocities, California's first lethal injection. Before the needle could take his life, he was given one final chance to speak. His words, "I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. I feel it sends the wrong message to the youth of the country. Young people act as they see other people acting, instead of as people tell them to act. And I would suggest that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did that, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." The mother hater. Carroll Edward Cole's life was marked by a betrayal so deep that it would shape the rest of his existence. While his father was away fighting in World War II, his mother dragged him into a world of secrets and lies. She took him along on her extramarital affairs, using fear and threats to keep him silent. "If you tell anyone, I'll beat you," she would say. This twisted dynamic set the stage for a lifelong pattern of hatred and violence, particularly towards women who reminded him of his unfaithful mother. By the age of 8, Cole's disturbing nature began to surface. He drowned a classmate, Dwayne, in a lake, and the death was conveniently ruled an accident. But for Carroll, it wasn't an accident. It was a revelation. Something dark had awakened within him, and it would never be extinguished. As an adult, Cole became a drifter, never settling in one place for long. He moved from city to city, from marriage to marriage, always haunted by the ghosts of his past. Wherever he went, there seemed to be a trail of dead women behind him. These were women who reminded him of his mother, women he perceived as unfaithful or dishonorable. His twisted logic convinced him they deserved to die. His first killing spree began in San Diego in 1971. Carroll would pick up women at bars, and if they revealed they were married or unfaithful, he would decide their fate. Some of these women were even married to him before their tragic end. In 1980, the police were preparing to release him due to lack of evidence in his wife's death. But instead of walking free, Cole shocked the authorities by confessing not only to that murder, but to a series of killings across the country. He claimed to have murdered at least 14 women in the span of 9 years. But he wasn't sure of the exact number, as he often committed his crimes while drunk. On April 9, 1981, Cole was convicted of 3 murders in Texas and sentenced to life in prison. But in 1984, after his mother's death, he seemed to change. He agreed to face additional charges for murders in Nevada, fully aware that the death penalty awaited him. In February of that year, Cole was extradited to Nevada, where he was tried for the strangulation deaths of 2 women in 1977 and 1979. By October 1984, he was sentenced to death. When the judge handed down the sentence, Cole simply replied, "Thanks, Judge." Carroll Edward Cole was executed on December 6, 1985, by lethal injection at Nevada State Prison. While his final words were not recorded, It's believed he had converted to Catholicism and found peace in the idea that death would bring an end to his personal torment. Thomas Weisenhand, the convenience store killer. At just 16 years old, Thomas Warren Weisenhand made a chilling prediction. Holding up a bullet, he told his friends, "This is going to kill somebody." That bullet did just that, claiming the life of 72-year-old Lexi Haynes in 1963 and marking the beginning of a terrifying killing spree that would last for over a decade. After serving time in the Air Force and prison for assault, Weisenhand's thirst for violence only deepened. He developed a chilling habit, targeting women who worked alone in convenience stores. Patricia Hitt, Benora Hyatt, and Cheryl Lynn Payton were just a few of the victims who would fall prey to Weisenhand's twisted need for control and terror. He didn't just kill, he often returned to the crime scenes to mutilate the bodies, an act that spoke to the deep sadism within him. Each victim was a piece in his cruel game, and he found pleasure in the aftermath of his violence. The final victim in his spree was 19-year-old Cheryl Lynn Payton, who was working at a convenience store in Mobile County on October 16, 1976. Weisenhand abducted her at gunpoint, sexually assaulted her, and killed her. But the horror didn't end there. The next day, he returned to desecrate her body, but this time, someone saw him. That witness led police to Weisenhand, who was quickly apprehended. During his interrogation, Weisenhand showed no remorse. He confessed to the murders with chilling indifference, calmly detailing his years of violence against innocent women. His lack of emotion only added to the unsettling nature of his crimes. After spending 32 years on death row, the longest tenure of any prisoner in Alabama's history, Weisenhand was finally given one last chance to speak before his execution. On May 27, 2010, he chose silence. His refusal to say a word would be his final statement, leaving a chilling legacy of brutality and apathy. Alton Coleman, the Midwest Terror. In the summer of 1984, a quiet terror swept through the heart of America. Alton Coleman and his accomplice, Deborah Brown, embarked on a savage killing spree that spanned 6 states. What began as a string of brutal crimes turned into a nightmare for families across the Midwest as the couple targeted anyone in their path, including children. For 2 months, the nation held its breath, waiting for the terror to end. Their first victim was 9-year-old Vernita Weed from Kenosha, Wisconsin. Coleman had earned the trust of her mother before abducting the innocent girl. When Vernita's body was discovered weeks later, the horror of what had happened became clear. She had suffered unimaginable torment before her death. The killing spree didn't stop there. In Gary, Indiana, Coleman and Brown attacked 2 young girls, leaving 9-year-old Annie Turks to survive. But tragically, her 7-year-old niece Tamika wasn't so fortunate. In Toledo, Ohio, the terror continued with the brutal strangulation of Virginia Temple and her 9-year-old daughter Rella. They were left in a crawl space, victims of a senseless, unrelenting act of violence. For 61 days, Coleman and Brown terrorized the Midwest, leaving a trail of devastation behind them. From families to children, no one was safe. It wasn't until the largest manhunt in the region's history that the authorities finally caught up with the pair. On July 20, 1984, Coleman and Brown were arrested in Evanston, Illinois, bringing an end to their reign of terror. By the time of his arrest, Coleman had become the only person in America to hold death sentences in 3 different states. On April 26, 2002, as the lethal injection began, Coleman recited Psalm 23. In his final moments, perhaps he found the peace that had eluded him throughout his life, a stark contrast to the violence he had left behind. The meanest man in America. Donald Henry Gaskins was a man who defied expectations. At just 5'5" and 130 pounds, he didn't look like the kind of man who would become one of America's most notorious killers. But beneath his unassuming exterior lurked a monster who had earned the grim title of the meanest man in America. His story began in the harsh streets of South Carolina, where life taught him early on that the world was unforgiving. His time in reform school only hardened him, shaping a broken individual who would go on to commit unimaginable crimes. Between 1970 and 1975, Gaskins went on what he called his coastal kills, a spree where he would target random victims along highways, driven by a desire for pure terror, torture, and murder. Some of his victims were familiar, including his own 15-year-old niece, while others were strangers who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from him. Gaskin's killing spree continued until 1975, when a tip from one of his associates led authorities to shallow graves near his home. The bodies of 8 victims were uncovered, and Gaskins was sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, Gaskins couldn't suppress the darkness inside him. In 1982, he was hired to kill a fellow death row inmate. When poison failed, Gaskins showed his true ingenuity. He constructed a device disguised as a communication tool, but it was packed with C4 explosives. When his target held the device to his ear, Gaskins detonated it from his own cell. The last thing he heard before the explosion was his own laugh. On September 6, 1991, after an attempt to end his own life hours before his execution, Gaskins was strapped into South Carolina's electric chair. His final words? A chilling, almost indifferent remark. "I'll let my lawyers talk for me. I'm ready to go." Desmond, the Fort Worth killer. In the winter of 1993, the city of Fort Worth, Texas, became the epicenter of a string of violent and chilling drug-related murders. Desmond Dominique Jennings, once a nursing aide, had spiraled into a life of crime. Robbery and murder were now his reality. His descent into darkness would lead to a night of terror that would change the lives of those involved forever. On December 27, 1993, Jennings and his accomplice, John Freeman, made their way into a house on a quiet Fort Worth street. When 44-year-old Sylvester Walton asked them what they wanted, Jennings responded with a brutal shot to his face, killing Walton instantly. But the terror didn't stop there. As they moved deeper into the house, they found 27-year-old Wanda Matthews lying on a bed. Without hesitation, Jennings fired a bullet into her head. Thinking she was dead, they went on to ransack the house. But when Jennings heard Wanda moaning, he returned to finish what he had started, shooting her a second time to ensure she wouldn't survive. Their violent spree didn't go unnoticed for long. Freeman, in an act of careless recklessness, was apprehended while driving a car matching the description of a vehicle linked to a robbery. A loaded .32 caliber handgun found in the trunk sealed their fate. The gun's bullets matched those used to kill Walton and Matthews. As Jennings awaited his fate, he grew defiant. On the day of his execution in 1999, he threatened to resist the process. When prison guards attempted to move him from his cell, Jennings refused and had to be subdued with pepper spray. His resistance became the first time since Texas had reinstated the death penalty that such measures were required to move a prisoner. Later that day, a 5-man team had to physically remove him for the execution. On November 16, 1999, Desmond Dominique Jennings was executed by lethal injection. When the warden asked if he had any final words, he simply responded with a cold, "No, I do not," before his life was taken.